Welcome back, everybody. Today we will be reading Chapter 13 of The Magicians, so let's get into it. Chapter 13, Fifth Year. Then September came, and it was just Quentin and Alice. The others were gone, in a swirl of falling leaves and a crackle of early frost. It was a shock to see them go, but along with the shock, mixed in with it like the liquor in a cocktail, was an even greater feeling of relief. Quentin wanted things to be good between them, to be better than good, to be perfect. But perfection is a nervy business, because the moment you spot the tiniest flaw, it's ruined. Perfection was part of Quentin's mythology of Brakebills, the story he told himself about his life there, a narrative as carefully constructed and reverently maintained as Fillory and Further. And he wanted to be able not just to tell it to himself, but to believe it. That had been getting progressively more difficult. Pressure was building up in some subterranean holding tank, and right at the end there, things had begun to come apart. Even Quentin, with his almost limitless capacity for ignoring the obvious, had begun to pick up on it. Maybe Alice was right. Maybe Janet really did hate her and love Elliot. Maybe it was something else. Something so glaringly obvious that Quentin couldn't stand to look at it directly. One way or another, the bonds that held them together were starting to fray. They were losing their magical ability to effortlessly love one another. Now, even though things would never be the same, even though they'd never be together in the same way, at least he could always remember it the way he wanted to. The memories were safe, sealed forever in amber. As soon as the semester began, Quentin did something he had already put off for much too long. He went to Dean Fogg and told him what had happened to Julia. Fogg just frowned and told him he'd take care of it. Quentin wanted to climb across the desk and grab Fogg by his natty lapples for what he'd done to her by screwing up the memory spells. He tried to explain to Fogg that he had made Julia suffer in a way that nobody should ever have to suffer. Fogg just watched, neither moved nor unmoved. In the end, the best Quentin could do was to make him promise that he would strain whatever the applicable regulations were to the breaking point to make things easier for her. It was all he could think of. He left Fogg's office feeling exactly as bad as he had when he entered it. Sitting at dinner or strolling between classes through the dusty hallways full of sideways afternoon light, Quentin began to realize for the first time how cut off from the rest of the school he and Alice had been for the past 2 years, and how few of the other students he really knew. All the groups were cliques unto themselves, but the physical kids had been especially tight, and now he and Alice were all that was left of them. He still had classes with the other fifth years, and he chatted with them in a friendly way, but he knew that their loyalties and their attention were elsewhere. "I bet they think we're horrible snobs," Alice said one day. "The way we keep to ourselves." They were sitting on the cool stone rim of the fountain known as Sammy, a knockoff of the Laocoon in Rome. Serpents strangling the renegade priest and his sons, but with water spurting cheerfully out of everybody's mouths. They had come out to try a piece of messy domestic magic for removing stains from a skirt of Alice's that was best performed outdoors, but they'd forgotten a key ingredient, turmeric, and weren't ready to face the walk back yet. It was a beautiful fall Saturday morning, or really it was closer to noon. The temperature balanced precariously on the tipping point between warm and chilly. "You think so, don't you?" "No, you're probably right," he sighed. "They probably do. Uncharitable bastards. They're the snobs." Alice tossed an acorn overhand at the fountain. It ticked off one of the dying priest's sturdy knees and into the water. "Do you think we are? Snobs, I mean," Quentin asked. I don't know. Not necessarily. No, I don't think we are. We have nothing against them. Exactly. Some of them are perfectly fine. Some of them we hold in the highest esteem. Exactly. Quentin dabbled his fingertips in the water. So what are you saying? We should go out and make friends? She shrugged. They're the only other magicians our age on the continent. They're the only peers we'll ever have. The sky was burning blue, and the tree branches stood out sharply against it in the clear, shivering reflection in the fountain. Okay, Quentin said, but not with all of them. Well, God, no. We'll be discriminating, anyway. Who even knows if they'll want to be friends with us? Right, so who? Does it matter? Of course it matters. Vix? Quentin said. It's not like they're all the same. Vix was a term of endearment with them, short for vixen, an allusion to their Antarctic interlude, vixen being the word for a female fox. So who? Serinda? Okay, sure. Or no, he's going out with that horrible second year. You know, with the teeth. She's always trying to make people do madrigals after dinner. What about Georgia? Maybe we're overthinking this. We can't force it. We'll just let it happen naturally. Okay. Quentin watched her study her nails with her intense bird-like focus. Sometimes she looked so beautiful he couldn't believe she had anything to do with him. He could barely believe she existed at all. But you have to do it, she said. If it's me, nothing's going to happen. You know I'm pathetic at that kind of thing. I know. She threw an acorn at him. You weren't supposed to agree. And so, with a concerted effort, they roused themselves from their stupor and embarked on a belated campaign to socialize with the rest of their class, most of whom they drifted almost completely out of touch with. In the end, it wasn't Serinda or Georgia or Gretchen, the blonde girl who walked with a cane, who turned out to be the key. It helped that Alice and Gretchen were both prefects, which was a source of both pride and embarrassment to them. The position carried with it almost no official duties. Mostly it was just yet another absurd infantilizing idea borrowed from the English public school system, a symptom of the Anglophilia that was embedded so deeply in the institutional DNA of Brakebills. Prefectships were given to the 4 students in the 4th and 5th years with the highest GPA, who then got, or had, to wear a silver pin in the shape of a bee on their jackets. Their actual responsibilities were petty things like regulating access to the single phone on campus, an obsolete rotary monster hidden away in a battle-scarred wooden phone booth that was itself tucked away under a back staircase, which always had a line a dozen students long. In return, they had access to the prefect's common room, a special locked lounge on the east side of the house with a high, handsome arched window, and a cabinet that was always stocked with sticky sweet sherry that Quentin and Alice forced themselves to drink. The prefect's common room was also an excellent place to have sex in, as long as they could square it with the other prefects in advance, but that usually wasn't a problem. Gretchen was sympathetic, since she had a boyfriend of her own, and the 3rd prefect was a popular girl with spiky blonde hair named Beatrice, whom nobody had even realized was especially smart before she was named a prefect. She never used the room anyway. The only real trick was avoiding the 4th prefect, because the 4th prefect was, of all people, Penny. The announcement that Penny was a prefect was so universally Quentin had barely spoken to Penny since their infamous altercation, not that he'd gone looking for him. From that day on, Penny had become a loner, a ghost, which was not an easy thing to be at a school as small as Breakbills, but he had a talent for it. He walked quickly between classes with a flat, frozen stare on his round frying pan face, bolted his food at meal times, went on long solitary rambles, stayed in his room in the afternoons after class, went to bed early, got up at dawn. What else he did, nobody knew. When the Breakbill students were sorted into groups by discipline at the end of second year, Penny wasn't assigned to a group at all. The rumor was that he had tested into a discipline so arcane and outlandish it couldn't be classified according to any of the conventional schemes. Whether it was true or not, next to his name on the official list, Fogg had simply put the word independent. He rarely turned up in class after that, and when he did, he lurked silently in the back of the room with his hands shoved in his pockets of his fraying Breakbill's blazer, never asking questions, never taking notes. He had an air of knowing things other people didn't. He was sometimes seen in the company of Professor Vanderweeg, under whose guidance he was rumored to be pursuing an intensive independent study. The prefect's common room was an increasingly important refuge for Quentin and Alice because their old sanctuary, the cottage, was no longer sacrosanct. Quentin had never really thought about it, but it was pure chance that last year nobody knew had been placed in the physical group, thus preserving the integrity of their little clique. But the drought was bound to come to an end, and it did. At the end of the previous semester, no fewer than 4 rising third years had tested into physical, and now, although it seemed wrong in every possible way, they had as much right to the cottage as Quentin and Alice did. They did their best to be good sports about it. On the first day of classes, they sat patiently in the library as the new physical kids went through the ritual and broke into the cottage. They debated long and earnestly about what to serve the newcomers when they came in, finally settling on a goodish champagne and, not wanting to be selfish, even though that was exactly how they felt, an obscenely expensive array of oysters and caviar with toast points and cream fraiche. "Cool," the physical kids said, one after another, as they made their way inside. They goggled at the oversized interior. They inspected the bric-a-brac and the piano and the cabinet of alphabetized twigs. They looked impossibly young. Quentin and Alice made small talk with them, trying to be witty and knowing, the way they remembered the others having been when they first got there. Sitting in a row on the couch, the third years squirmed and sipped their champagne too quickly, like children wanting to be excused. They asked polite questions about the paintings in the cottage library. Do the books circulate outside the building? Did they really have a first edition Abracadarian Arcana in the hand of Pseudo-Dionysus himself? Really? And when was the cottage first constructed? Really? Wow, that's old. That's like ancient. Then, after a suitable interval, they disappeared en masse into the pool room. They showed no particular desire to be chaperoned there, and Quentin and Alice had no particular desire ever to see them again, so they stayed where they were. As the evening wore on, the sounds of adolescent bonding could be heard. It became apparent to Quentin and Alice that they were the relics of an earlier era that had worn out its welcome. They had come full circle. They were outsiders again. "I feel like an elderly docent," Quentin said. "I already forgot their names," Alice said. "They're like quadruplets." "We should give them numbers. Tell them it's a tradition. And then we could always call them by the wrong number, freak them out. Or we could call them all the same thing, Alfred or something. Even the girls? Especially the girls." They were sipping tepid leftover champagne. They were getting drunk, but Quentin didn't care. From the pool room came the glittery tinkle of breaking glass, a champagne flute, probably, and then, a little later, the sound of a sash being raised and somebody throwing up, hopefully out the window. The problem with growing up, Quentin said, is that once you're grown up, people who aren't grown up aren't fun anymore. We should have burned this place down, Alice said gloomily. They were definitely drunk. Been the last ones out the door and then torched it. And then walked away with it burning behind us in the background like in a movie. End of an era. End of an epoch. Which one? Era or epoch? What's the difference? Quentin didn't know. They would have to find something else, he thought mazily. Something new. Couldn't stay here anymore. Couldn't go back, only forward. Do you think we were ever like this? Quentin asked. Like these kids? Probably. I bet we were even worse. I don't know how the others put up with us. You're right, he said. You're right. God. They were so much nicer than we are. That winter, Quentin didn't go home for the holidays. Around Christmas time, real-world Christmas, he'd had the usual conversation with his parents about Breakbill's unusual schedule, which he had to remind them about every year. Lounging inside the old phone booth under the back stairs with one foot braced up against the folding wooden door. Then by the time Breakbill's calendar Christmas rolled around, it was already March in the real world, and it didn't seem like such a big deal not to go back. If they had asked him, if they'd put it out there for an instant that they were eager to see him or that they would be disappointed if he didn't come, he might have caved. He would have in a second. But they were their usual blithe, oblivious, glass-eyed selves. And besides, he got an independent feeling from coolly informing them that he had other plans, thanks very much. Instead, Quentin went home with Alice. It was her idea, though as it got closer to the holidays, Quentin wasn't exactly sure why she'd invited him, since the prospect obviously made her suicidally uncomfortable. I don't know, she said when he asked her. It just seemed like the kind of things boyfriends and girlfriends do. Well, whatever. I don't have to come. I'll just stay here. Just say I had a paper to finish or something. I'll see you in January. But don't you want to come? She wailed. Of course I do. I want to see where you came from. I want your parents to know who I am, and God knows I'm not taking you back to my parents' house. All right. She didn't sound any less anxious. Do you promise to hate my parents as much as I do? Oh, absolutely, Quentin said. Maybe even more. The opening of the portals home for vacation was always a complicated and tedious procedure that inevitably led to huge numbers of break-billions, backed up with all their luggage in a ragged line that wound down the dark, narrow corridor leading to the main living room, where Professor Vanderweeg was in charge of getting people where they needed to go. Everybody was relieved that exams were over, and there was always a lot of giddy pushing and shoving and shrieking and casting of minor pyrotechnic spells. Quentin and Alice waited together in silence with their packed bags, solemnly, side by side. Quentin looking as respectable as he could manage. He hardly had any clothes anymore that weren't part of Breakbill's uniform. He knew Alice was from Illinois, and he knew Illinois was in the Midwest, but he couldn't have pointed to the precise location of that state within 1,000 miles. Apart from a European vacation in junior high, he'd barely even been off the East Coast, and his Breakbill's education hadn't done much to improve this grasp of American geography. And as it turned out, he hardly saw Illinois anyway, or at least not its exterior. Professor Vanderweeg set up the portal to open directly into an ante-room inside Alice's parents' house. Stone walls, flat mosaic floors, post and lintel doorways on all sides. It was a precise recreation of a traditional Boyge Roman residence. Sound echoed in it like a church. It was like stepping past the red velvet rope at a museum. Magic tended to run in families. Quentin was an exception in that respect, and Alice's parents were both magicians. She had never had to sneak around behind their backs the way he had to do with his parents. "Welcome to the house that time forgot to forget," Alice said sulkily, kicking her bags into a corner. She led him by the hand along an alarmingly long, dark corridor to a sunken living room with cushions and hard Roman-style couches strewn around at careless angles, and a modest plashing fountain in the middle. "Daddy changes it all around every few years," she explained. "He mostly does architectural magic. When I was little, it was all Baroque gold knobs on everything. That was almost nice. But then it was Japanese paper screens. You know, you could hear everything. Then it was falling water, Frank Lloyd Wright, until Mom got sick of living in a mildew farm for some reason. And then, for a while, it was just a big old Iroquois longhouse with a dirt floor. No walls. That was hilarious. We had to beg him to put in a real bathroom. I think he seriously thought we were going to watch him defecate into a pit. I doubt even the Indians did that." With that, she sat down heavily on a hard leather Roman couch, opened a book, and became absorbed in her vacation reading. Quentin understood that it was sometimes better to wait out Alice's black periods than to try to coax her out of them. Everybody has their own idiopathic reaction to their childhood home, so he spent the next hour wandering around what looked remarkably like an upper-middle-class Pompeian household, complete with pornographic frescoes. It was obsessively authentic except for the bathrooms. A concession had obviously been granted on that score. Even dinner, when it arrived, served by a squad of 3-foot-tall animated wooden marionettes, who made little click-clacking noises as they walked, was revoltingly historical. Calf brains, parrot tongues, a roasted moray eel, all peppered beyond the point of edibility, just in case they weren't inedible to begin with. Fortunately, there was plenty of wine. They had progressed to the third course, the stuffed and roasted uterus of a sow, when a short, portly, round-faced man suddenly appeared in the doorway. He was dressed in a well-worn toga, the gray of unlaundered bedsheets. He hadn't shaved for several days, and his dark stubble extended well down his neck, and what hair he had left on his head could have used cutting. "Abeatique valet," he proclaimed. He gave an elaborate, made-up-looking Roman salute, which was essentially the same as a Nazi salute. "Welcome to the Domus of Danielius." He made a face that implied that it was other people's fault that the joke wasn't funny. "Hi, Dad," Alice said. "Dad, this is my friend Quentin." "Hi." Quentin stood up. He'd been trying to eat reclining, Roman style, but it was harder than it looked, and he had a stitch in his side. Alice's father shook his outstretched hand. He seemed to forget he was doing it halfway through, then looked surprised to find a fleshy alien extremity still in his grip. "Are you really eating that stuff? I had Domino's an hour ago." "We didn't know there was anything else. Where's Mom?" "Who knows?" Alice's father said. He bugged his eyes out like it was a wacky mystery. "She was working on one of her compositions downstairs, last I saw." He jogged the few steps down into the room, sandals slapping the stone tiles, and served himself some wine from a decanter. "And that was when? November? Don't ask me. I lose track of time in this damn place. Why don't you put in some windows, Daddy? It's so dark in here. Windows? He bugged out his eyes again. It appeared to be his signature facial expression. You speak of some barbarian magic of which we noble Romans know nothing. You've done an amazing job here, Quentin piped up. The soul of obsequiousness. It looks really authentic. Thank you. Alice's father drained the goblet and poured himself another, then sat down heavily on a couch, spilling a purple track of wine down the front of his toga in the process. His bare calves were plump and bone white. Black bristles stood straight out from them in static astonishment. Quentin wondered how his beautiful Alice could possibly share a single base pair of genetic information with this person. It took me 3 years to put it together, he said. 3 years. And you know what? I'm already sick of it after 2 months. I can't eat the food. There are skid marks on my toga, and I have plantar fasciitis from walking around on these stone floors. What is the point of my life? He looked at Quentin furiously, as if he actually expected an answer, as if Quentin were concealing it from him. Would someone tell me that, please? Because I have no idea. None. Alice glared at her father like he'd just killed her pet. Quentin stayed perfectly still, as if that meant that Alice's father, like a dinosaur, couldn't see him. They all three sat in awkward silence for a long beat. Then he stood up. Gratias, and good night. He tossed the train of his toga over his shoulder and strode out of the room. The marionette's feet clack-clicked on the stone floor as they mopped up the spilled wine he left behind. That's my dad, Alice said loudly, and rolled her eyes as if she expected a laugh track to kick in behind her. None did. In the midst of this domestic wasteland, Alice and Quentin established a workable, even comfortable routine for themselves. Invaders staking out a safe perimeter deep in hostile territory. It was weirdly liberating to be in the middle of somebody else's domestic agony. He could see the bad emotional energy radiating out in all directions, sterilizing every available surface with its poisonous particles, but it passed through him harmlessly, like neutrons. And he was like Superman here. He was from off-planet, and that made him immune to any local villainy. But he could see it doing its ruinous work on Alice, and he tried to shield her as best he could. He knew the rules here instinctively, what it meant to have parents who ignored you. The only difference was that his parents did it because they loved each other, Alice's because they hated each other. If nothing else, the house was quiet and well stocked with Roman-style wine, sweet but perfectly drinkable. It was also reasonably private. He and Alice could share a bedroom without her parents caring or even noticing. And there were the baths. Alice's dad had excavated huge, cavernous, underground Roman baths that they had all to themselves, huge, oblong aquifers, scooped out of the midwestern tundra. Every morning, they would spend a good hour trying to fling each other into the scalding caldarium and the glacial frigidarium, which were equally unbearable, and then soaking naked in the tepidarium. Over the course of 2 weeks, Quentin glimpsed Alice's mother exactly once. If anything, she looked even less like Alice than Alice's father did. She was thin and tall, taller than her husband, with a long, narrow, animated face, and a dry bunch of blonde-brown hair tied back behind her head. She chattered earnestly to him about the research she was doing on fairy music, which was, she explained, mostly scored for tiny bells and inaudible to human beings. She lectured Quentin for almost an hour with no prompting on his part, and without once asking him who he was or what exactly he was doing in her house. At one point, one of her slight breasts wandered out of the misbuttoned cardigan that she wore with nothing under it. She tucked it back in without the slightest trace of embarrassment. Quentin had the impression that it had been some time since she had spoken to anybody. "So I'm a little worried about your parents," Quentin said that afternoon. "I think they might be completely insane." They had retreated to Alice's bedroom, where they lay side by side on her enormous bed in their bathrobes, looking up at the mosaic on the ceiling. Orpheus singing to a ram, an antelope, and an assortment of attentive birds. "Are they? Alice, I think you know they're kind of weird. I hate them, but they're my parents. I don't see them as insane. I see them as sane people who deliberately act like this to torture me. When you say they're mentally ill, you're just letting them off the hook. You're helping them elude prosecution. Anyway, I thought you might find them interesting," she said. "I know how mentally excited you get about anything magical. Well, for your enjoyment, 2 career magicians." He wondered, theoretically, which of them had it worse. Alice's parents were toxic monsters, but at least you could see it. His own parents were more like vampires or werewolves. They passed for human. He could rave about their atrocities all he wanted. He knew the villagers would never believe him till it was too late. "At any rate, I can see where you get your social skills," he said. "My point is, you don't know what it's like to grow up in a family of magicians." "Well, I didn't know you had to wear a toga." "You don't have to wear togas. That's exactly the problem, Q. You don't have to do anything. This is what you don't understand. You don't know any older magicians except our professors. It's a wasteland out there. Out here. You can do nothing or anything or everything, and none of it matters. You have to find something to really care about to keep from running totally off the rails. A lot of magicians never find it." Her voice was strangely urgent, almost angry. He was trying to catch up to her. "So you're saying your parents didn't?" "No, they didn't, despite their having had 2 children, which would have given them a minimum of 2 good options. Well, I think they might have cared about Charlie, but when they lost him, they lost their way completely, and here they are." "What about your mom and her fairy orchestras? She seems pretty serious about them." "That's just to annoy my dad. I'm not even sure they exist." Suddenly, Alice rolled over on top of him, straddling him, hands on his shoulders, pinning him down. Her hair hung straight down at him in a shimmering curtain, tickling his face and giving her the very authoritative appearance of a goddess leaning down from the heavens. "You have to promise me we'll never be like them, Quentin." Their noses were almost touching. Her weight on top of him was arousing, but her face was angry and serious. "I know you think it's going to be all quests and dragons and fighting evil and whatever, like in Fillory. I know that's what you think, but it's not. You don't see it yet. There's nothing out there. So you have to promise me, Quentin, let's never get like this, with these stupid hobbies nobody cares about, just doing pointless things all day and hating each other and wanting to die." "Well, you drive a hard bargain," he said. "But okay, I promise." "I'm serious, Quentin. It's not going to be easy. It's going to be so much harder than you think. They don't even know, Quentin. They think they're happy. That's the worst part." She undid the drawstring on his pajama bottoms without looking and jerked them down, still staring directly into his eyes. Her robe was already open at the waist, and she had nothing on under it. He knew she was saying something important, but he wasn't grasping it. He put his hands under her robe, feeling her smooth back and curve of her waist. Her heavy breasts brushed against his chest. They would always have magic. They would have They would have it forever. So what? Maybe they are happy, he said. Maybe this is just who they are. No, Quentin, they aren't, and it isn't. She twined her fingers into his hair and gripped it hard so that it hurt. God, you were such a child sometimes. They were moving together now, breathing hard. Quentin was inside her, and they couldn't talk anymore, except for Alice, just repeating, "Promise me, Q. Promise me. Just promise." She said it angrily, insistently, over and over again, as if he were arguing, and if he wouldn't have agreed to absolutely anything at that moment. That's the end for this week, and we'll see you guys next week.